Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you ever so much, Mike.
Jonathan Norman is the knowledge manager of the Major Projects Association. And as such, he is also responsible for their YouTube channel and all of its rich and deep content, which I really do recommend you get into, particularly if large projects are something that you aspire to get involved in. But Jonathan actually spent most of his career working in the world of publishing. And over 30 years, he commissioned some of the best and most important project management books, although sadly, none of mine. Jonathan and I worked together recently when he invited me to join him in delivering a seminar for the Major Projects Association on transactional analysis. And that flows from his lifelong fascination with communication in the world at work. And that's why I wanted to speak with Jonathan about building a working relationship with your project sponsor. So, Jonathan, welcome.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you ever so much, Mike.
It's great to have you here. And I think we should dive in at the beginning, because the relationship with a project sponsor, between a project manager and a project sponsor, is so important. How do we go about establishing that relationship in the first place?
Well, I think it's something that you need to plan and you need to consider before you actually jump in. One of the things that's been interesting about the pandemic and lockdown is that we've all wrestled with working collaboratively online, and we've had to find a variety of media and a variety of ways of enabling us to build relationships and report online. And it's very tempting to take those for granted in real life. You know, we know how to interact with people, we know how to meet people, we'll just talk to the sponsor and away we go. But actually, it really benefits from a bit of planning. So I think in terms of building the relationship, first of all, do a bit of research. Who is this person?
Yeah, absolutely.
What are their interests? What are their track records? Talk to other people who've worked with them, so you've got some sort of sense of who you're dealing with.
I think that's interesting in itself, because when I was actively managing projects back in the 90s, we couldn't just jump onto the internet and find out pretty much their whole career history, and which is so easy to do now. I think there's no excuse for not doing your homework.
Yeah. I agree completely. I mean, it's just such an easy way of building rapport, is to show them that you've done some research and to show interest in something that's they've expressed, or something that's important to them.
Yeah.
I think that the next element is really finding out what makes your project sponsor tick. So what's their attitude to the whole role of sponsorship? Is it something that they're going to do for 20 minutes on a Friday? Is it something that they take really seriously and they're really dedicated to? Because that will kind of give you some parameters as to how you're going to need to work together. What's their attitude towards the project?
Yeah.
How do they see the project? I published a great book, I guess it's probably about 15 years ago, called Images of Projects, which looked at the project as from a variety of different perspectives. So it looked at the project as a value creation exercise. It looked at the project as a kind of temporary organization. And I think if you talk to the sponsor and get a sense of, what does this project mean to you? It's the old I'm changing the way people think about God, or I'm just actually pointing around a window on a cathedral. It's that kind of sense of, is it the big vision? Is it the little vision? Are they concerned about the costs? Are they more interested in the outcome? How do they kind of feel about it? And what's the language that they use? Listen to the language that they use when they're talking about the project. A, because it can kind of guide you as to the sort of language you might use back to them. But B, it will also give you a sense as to how they feel about this project and their relationship with the project. So I think those are the kind of starting points that I would.
And let's not forget that project sponsors are ordinary human beings, and therefore there's all the different varieties of self-interest. Are they interested in what they can get out of it literally for themselves, or are they interested in what the organization can get out of it, their team, their division? Actually, that what's in it for me factor is a crucial kind of element of that.
And you started by saying how important the project sponsor is, and my goodness, they are. They're the kind of guardians of value in the project, and you need to work with the relationship as it is. I mean, you can obviously try and influence the relationship, but if you've got a project sponsor that's going to be absent or that has a particular view on a project, you're kind of stuck with that. So you need to think about how you're going to adapt your own work to kind of allow you to work effectively with that person.
Yeah, absolutely. You use the phrase "make people" how they'll sponsor. What makes them tick? And of course, that in my mind conjures up that kind of more psychological element as well. And I don't know about you, but we may have an interest in it, but we're not trained psychologists as project managers, or very few of us are. So I don't think it's appropriate to try and psychoanalyze our sponsors. But I know you are interested in that area and you have a lot of knowledge. Are there any kind of clues you're looking for, any big indicators that will give you a hint as to how best to build the relationship and get something out of that relationship that benefits you both?
Well, I think the most obvious starting point is the nature of your first conversations with the project sponsor. Are they giving you time? Are they listening to you, or are they saying that I've only got 5 minutes, talking over you, talking at you? Because that's a kind of really good indicator. Is this person starting from the kind of leader as steward, leader as facilitator roles? They're actually there to make life easier for you, or are they expecting you to kind of serve them? What's the nature of the relationship that they anticipate? And you'll get that from the interaction that you have, again, from the language that they use, and also from talking to other people. I can't reiterate that enough. Talk to people who work with this person. What is he or she like to work with?
Although I would always add a caveat. There is always a danger in taking your impression from other people, because people also project onto each other their own kind of attitudes. You need to be looking. If you speak to one person, they say, well, this sponsor is trouble. That might not tell you anything about the sponsor. It will only tell you about the relationship they have with that sponsor. So, and again, first impressions are important, but they're not everything. And so you have to, I think, make a deliberate decision to build up your evidence base rather than to jump to conclusions.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the other thing that's important is about how you project yourself. You're there to make sure that the sponsor realizes that you're professional. You have certain needs and requirements. This isn't just about you reporting to the project sponsor. This is about the project sponsor giving you and the project what the project needs.
Absolutely.
So you need to be gently assertive, and you need to be confident. There's nothing wrong with saying to the sponsor, look, this first time I've done a project like this, so I'm really looking forward to drawing on your experience. You can flatter them, and just be kind of honest, and I guess this is a personal beef of mine, the fact that we do tend to kowtow to hierarchy a bit. Senior people, we kind of nod and still tug the forelock. I don't think that's a really healthy basis for a relationship. This should be a relationship of equals. You have different roles to perform, but you're essentially equally valuable as human beings.
I think that's exactly right. I did a video recently on sunflower bias, which by the time our discussion goes out will be available. So I'll link to that in the description below. And that bias is really all about individuals within a team actually turning their attention and their trust towards one person simply because they're the brightest source in the room. And hierarchically, that will be the sponsor, and that creates a real danger when it comes to decision making and problem solving, because if they aren't aware of that risk, and if you aren't aware of that risk, then there can be that huge bias involved in that.
Yeah, I learned a good technique actually when I early in my career when I was in sales, and I learned to help avoid people deferring to you when they should be deferring to other people. So if you're in a meeting and you know your colleague perhaps is a woman and she's talking, but the person over the other side of the table, perhaps a man, consistently looks at you and defers to you, is to look at your colleague and in doing so, rather than looking at the person who's talking, the person over the other side of the table, look at your colleague and kind of force them to look at her and listen to her and kind of do that. So I think that's something that we can all do.
Yeah, I've actually discovered that as well for the same reasons in the consulting world. Anything else we need to do in establishing the relationship before we move on? Because you've already kind of hinted that there's a process that you're going to need to build, and you're going to need to kind of establish that with the sponsor. But before we move on, anything else on establishing the relationship for you?
I think it's worth, you know, as you move into the process itself, actually that is still part of establishing the relationship. You're establishing the parameters of the project and the parameters of decision making, and you're also agreeing between yourselves how things might work. So what does the project sponsor need? How does he or she like you to, and when does he or she like you to escalate things? So you kind of building one or two early heads of agreement in terms of how you're going to work together, and that is not only useful in terms of laying out the landscape going as you go forward, but it's also reassuring the project sponsor that you're a safe pair of hands and you know what you're doing, and they can trust you, because fundamentally that's what you want. You want their trust and their confidence, because that will help them to go into bat for you if and when you need them to do so.
Yeah, I mean, trust is a two-way thing, but you you can only respond with your trust as you find them. You can't control that. But what you can do, I agree, is to do all the things that build trust, and those are around being consistent, being reliable, being knowledgeable, and showing that your interests lie with the project and hopefully align with theirs. Clearly, if their interests don't align with the project, you've got a far bigger problem. But assuming their interests align with the project, if you can show yours do too, I think that works nicely. So we are going into this thing about agreeing kind of how you're going to work together and what that relationship's going to look like day to day.
Yes.
What thoughts have you got about, firstly, the kind of process of agreeing the process, if you like? How do you kind of communicate what it is we're going to do, and what are some of the important building blocks of a good relationship? Because my experience is that when things are going well, if you've got a good sponsor, it's an easy relationship and it's really nice. But even with a good sponsor where there's good levels of trust, good levels of respect and everything, projects get tough, and that can put a big strain on even the strongest relationships. So we've got to set all that up. So let's start with, how do you set it up, and then what do we need to be setting up? What are the components of it?
Yes, yeah, I think that's a good point, and actually, although people wouldn't necessarily use this language, this is part of governance. This is agreeing, what are we going to do if this happens? How are we going to handle this issue? And kind of setting those agreements in, they're not set in stone, but between you have an understanding that this is the way that you're going to work together. And I think it's worth looking at the formal aspects of the relationship. So what are the formal things in terms of reporting, in terms of escalating, in terms of requesting help, and also what are the informal elements of that? And does your sponsor put more emphasis on the formal? How do they feel about the less formal, the more informal ways of working? Thinking about the informal is just as important as the formal. That's also because your project sponsor needs to know what's going on. And you need to know what's going on. You need to know what's happening in the project board, what's happening at board level. How do people, how does the organization, how do the higher ups feel about this project that you're working on? How do people with whom the project sponsor is working, how do they feel about it? And a lot of that is nuanced. This is kind of intelligence that is told through stories rather than through a 22-page report.
Yes.
And so kind of working how you're going to communicate those stories to your project sponsor and how he or she is going to communicate that nuanced information to you is an important part of kind of establishing the communication channels that you're going to use.
Yeah. And I think in a lot of organizations, the hierarchical difference between the project sponsor and their project manager is an issue. And it can get in the way of building that informal relationship. And I know that probably most of the people who are listening to this are at a stage in their career where they are the project manager working with a project sponsor. But a lot of you listening now will be project sponsors at some point in your career. And my plea to you is, please do, from time to time as a project sponsor, take your project manager out for a coffee. Now, I know at the moment we're locked down and you can't do that, but even metaphorically, have that part of the Zoom call that is informal and chat. In the real world, take the project manager out for a coffee, and because that's the way you will build the relationship up so that you can share. And I'm not talking about accidentally sharing confidential information. We're all professionals, but you can share the information that will help each of you to do your job well, and to build the kind of relationship which will have that depth to deal with the tough times. So you're absolutely right that project sponsors are creatures of governance, and they need to fulfill their governance role. But the relationship has to have an informal element to it too. Having been in that project manager role and work with sponsors, that's when it works best.
Yeah, and it is, it is a genuinely symbiotic relationship. I mean, you need the sponsor, that's for sure. But honestly, they need you. I mean, if you can't deliver this project, it's not going to look good for them.
Yeah.
So they're just as dependent on as you are on the kind of mutual relationship.
Yeah. And after a kind of lifetime of not only being involved in projects, but also professionally reading lots of different ideas, are there any specific kind of process elements that you think will help both the formal and the informal sides of the relationship to progress and to stay sound and solid?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple. I think it's really worth thinking about using process reviews. I mean, you don't necessarily need to use that language, but remembering what I said at the beginning about this being a very conscious process and a planned and designed process. So make sure you and your sponsor are checking in, and once you've had a discussion about something, just take a moment to say, so how was that for you? Was that good? We tackled that problem together. Are you happy with the outcome? Could we have done it better? How might we do it better together in the future? And I think, again, planning conversations before you start. I really love this technique that Bob McGannon, I learned from Bob McGannon in his wonderful book on intelligent disobedience, which is this idea of 30-3-30. And basically what you do is you bump into you get your project sponsor in the corridor, and you've got 30 seconds to do your elevator pitch to explain to him or her why you're not going to do something that might be expected. You're going to perhaps do something a bit unexpected. So it's your third. Depending on the kind of response that you get to that, you then want to make sure you've already prepared a 3-minute presentation, so you can drag them off into a room and you can actually give them a bit more detail.
Yeah.
And you've also got the basis for a 30-minute presentation, whether that's to the sponsor, whether that's to the project board, whether that's to members of the project team, assuming the project sponsor says, yeah, this is important, I think we need to take it.
Yeah.
So you've actually planned that whole cycle out in advance.
Yeah.
And you're ready, A, to deliver it, but also B, you're ready not to deliver it. So if that first 30 seconds goes down like a lead balloon, you kind of know, right, okay, I'm going to have to approach this from another angle.
But actually, that 30 seconds, with some project sponsors, that's all they need.
Yeah.
They'll say, great, I've got it. I understand. They might ask you a couple of clarifying questions, but then they're off and doing their job. That's a really good project sponsor, isn't it? Who gets the point straight away and takes it on board because you've asked them for a decision, or you've asked them for an access to a resource, and you don't need to give them that big whole 3-minute details or a presentation. They've got it, and the reason they've got it in that 30 seconds is because you have taken the trouble to distill the 30-minute presentation down to a very clear set of priorities. Yeah, I like that a lot. That's a lovely model.
And I think the other thing is things like agreeing that you're going to report by exception. So basically, you're going to focus on the things that are unusual, the things that are out of the normal. So you're not going to waste his or her time just telling them what they can already read in any of the project reports. You're actually kind of guiding them to, I think this is the thing that you should have sleepless nights about. These are the things that I worry about, and these are the things that I think you should spend your time thinking about as a project sponsor.
Any other thoughts about good process?
I think as a project manager, you have a role almost as a designer. You should be thinking about how am I going to frame whatever do I need a decision? Have we got a problem? How am I going to frame that? And how am I going to help the project sponsor make sense of what I'm talking about? Because it could be quite complicated, quite complex, and you need to do a bit of sense making for them to show them the landscape. And I think using visual cues, not just relying on words, but using figures, illustrations, analogies, pictures, and then concentrating on kind of projecting the future. So I think this is where we want to go. So guiding them so that you don't just lead them into a morass and say, well, sorry, I need your help. We've driven into a swamp. You're actually kind of showing them the nice hard ground on the other side of the swamp, and you're suggesting how we might get there. So you're really helping them rather than just giving them a kind of, you seem to be using a lot of sports analogies, but giving them effectively a hospital pass. So oh, here you go, help me with this because it's beyond me. No, I think I'm always intrigued when anybody, it doesn't have to be a project manager, when people say that's above my pay grade, because I'm thinking, I think that's a real cop out. I don't think anything is above anybody's pay grade, basically. So,
well, I suppose what it depends on is the nature of the organization. Some organizations will put a limit on your authority, and not expect you to even be thinking beyond your level of authority. Whereas I think good modern organizations are saying, you know what, if you are acting with integrity and you are taking the proper steps to get decisions when you need them, then go at it. But I think that whole thing about finding out, you said make sure you give your sponsor figures, diagrams, all this. I kind of turn it on its head in a way and say that part of that discovery stage of establishing relationships is we're going to be producing a report every month. You know, how do you like your reports? Do you like detailed reports, or do you like summary reports? Do you like lots of diagrams, or do you find them annoying? Do you like tables? And the more you can understand about how your sponsor, and indeed your whole project board, and anyone within the governance structure in particular, how they like to consume information, and design and build a reporting process that matches their preferences for absorbing information.
Yeah.
And it's also, as a project manager, you need to deliver certain pieces of information because of your accountability and the needs of transparency. So you've got that base load, but then there's also, well, Ms. or Mr. Sponsor, what information would you like to have to feel that you can discharge your role and you can feel comfortable? Because if I can provide it, I will.
Yeah.
And so it's about building that.
Yeah, and of course, if you're in a reasonable sized organization, you're not on your own. I mean, hopefully there's an effective PMO function, so you can go to them and you can see what they're doing, and you can kind of learn from them.
Yeah.
And I think this is, again, it's about being savvy and not feeling that you have to do all the heavy lifting. There are others that can help you.
Yeah, and a good PMO, of course, will have a pretty shrewd idea as an organization and as individuals what the different sponsors in the organization are like and what their needs are.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, yes.
Well, let's move on, because we've established a relationship and now we've agreed the process. So on the face of it, everything is hunky-dory. The whole project is going to go swimmingly, and your relationship with your sponsor is in great shape, and it will stay in great shape. So what could possibly go wrong, Jonathan?
What could go wrong, indeed? Yes, yeah. Yeah, I think, it's interesting to think back to when I started my job at the Major Projects Association, and that was 4 years ago now. And I think if you think about how you feel when you first start a new job, and actually the relationship with the project sponsor is a bit like that. You don't necessarily know this person, you haven't worked with them before, and you will find, unless you're very lucky, you will find that sometimes they do things which you weren't expecting, or sometimes you've misinterpreted their behavior. And I think, being ready for that challenge, and it may come, the challenge could come from the project. You have driven into a swamp, and that creates stress and pressure all around.
Or sometimes the swamp has come up to meet you, to be fair.
Yeah, well, that's also true. Or it could be just because you've been a bit, you've made too many assumptions about the sponsor, particularly if you're working with them virtually, and you've been I've worked with this kind of person before, and you've kind of discounted that this is an individual. And I think, I think having a good degree of empathy, and I've, for me, it's almost a physical activity of, moving into my sponsor's shoes and looking at what am I looking at now. If I go around the other side of the table, what is he or she looking at and seeing? And suddenly I think, actually, you know what? I get it entirely. I now understand why I got that reaction, because he or she is concerned about that, or this is the way they like to do things, and I'm advocating something very different. And I find it, it's something you have to teach yourself, to talk to yourself, and to kind of just get over yourself, because your natural reaction when faced with a sponsor that you feel is being deliberately obstructive or unhelpful or aggressive, or is to think, it's them. The problem is them. And I think that's not very helpful at two levels. The problem may be them, but the first reason it's not very helpful is because the only person over whom you have some agency in this relationship is you.
Absolutely.
So if you want the other person to change, you can only do it by changing yourself. You can't say, I expect him or her to be like this. And the second reason is because you're almost certainly overlooking an aspect of the project, or you're making assumptions about this person. And when you do go around the table and look at it from their perspective, I find that you suddenly think, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. No, that's yeah, no, I can see why, and it's actually a really useful exercise for you. So I think
I'd add a third reason, because the reality of even sophisticated major projects these days is that in the sponsor project manager relationship, at the moment, I would say in 90% of cases at least, only one of you is a professional in your role. As a project manager, you are a professional project manager. Your project sponsor is not. Some will have had some training, and particularly, we're in the UK and we know that, the government departments are rolling out training for project sponsors for large projects in government, which is fantastic. But even those people are not professional project sponsors. They're just professional civil servants trained in project sponsorship. So as a professional project manager, your interest should not be in being right. It should be in progressing the project. And sometimes it is more important to suck it up and be the professional and say, okay, because that will progress the project, than it is to be right, even if you are right. and it is very possible that you could be right, and yet enforcing your correctness is the wrong thing to do because of that professionalism.
I agree. And in most projects, and particularly major projects, there is no right.
Yeah.
There is the solution that you can all live with, or the best solution.
There are flavors on the spectrum from ideal to not ideal.
Yeah. I published a book by David Hancock called Tame, Messy and Wicked Risk Leadership. And in that, David explained that when he was working on Terminal 5 and suddenly they were hit with an issue that maybe it had been on the risk register, maybe it hadn't, but it came along. And he said, look, there is no simple, you look at the risk, what's the solution? There's no mathematical solution to this. The solution is you pick up the telephone to the stakeholders, you tell them what the problem is, you outline the problem, you agree a solution collectively, and that's what you're aiming for. And that's the nature of projects, and that's the nature of the relationship with the project sponsor. There are a number of techniques that you can use when, if you're facing a challenge and if it is difficult. I think it's always worth trying to externalize the problem. Now, that may be particularly difficult if you're interacting in the way that we're interacting, and you're not in the same room, in the same space as the project sponsor. But getting him or her to focus on the problem rather than focus on you, and you're looking at the same problem together in sort of physical terms, you're on both on the same side of the table rather than one on either side of the table. And I think that can be really, really valuable. And again, the art of rehearsal and planning can allow you to be ready with a challenge, because your project sponsor may be saying things that you need to push back on. So they may be making assumptions, and you just want to say, can I stop you there? You're taking that as for granted, or you're taking that as a given. Is that right? Is that why are you doing that? And there are times, if you've got a good relationship with the project sponsor, where you can actually help them reflect on the biases they have, the things that they were taking for granted, and hey, actually you're right. No, sorry. No, instead, because you want to avoid, if you can, being forced down a particular rabbit hole if you don't need to go down that rabbit hole. So if actually you're going down because a project sponsor seems to think you should go down that rabbit hole, if you don't think you should, then check why do they think this is the right rabbit hole.
One of the senior people I work with, I learned a lot from, and he had a fantastic technique for doing that, because as soon as you say, why are you saying that, you raise hackles. Even in a good relationship, it's dangerous. And he used a phrase, I heard him use it twice, and I thought, that the second time, first time I noticed it, the second time I thought, that's deliberate, I'm writing it down, because it worked. And he said something along the lines of, could we please just take a couple of minutes to explore that, because I'm not quite sure I understand the subtleties around it. And what he was basically saying is, whatever you said, it's my problem and I'm confused, so help me. But by kind of compelling that discussion, you can go deeper into the underlying assumptions, and it worked magnificently. And I've used it a couple of times myself, because that's what we do as project managers. We rob the techniques that work, and we use them shamelessly, because our job is to make things happen.
Yes. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think, if it gets really tough, I mean, you can do things. There's a great technique that I learned from Eddie Obeng called extreme matching.
All right.
Which is where, you get the project sponsor will say, I'm really concerned about the fact that this is going to impact on the schedule. You kind of, instead of reassuring them, or you actually take a more extreme view. It reminds me of the old Monty Python sketch. You had a paper bag. You were lucky.
Yeah.
It's that kind of. I can hear you're extremely concerned. I'm absolutely incandescent that it's in, and you kind of play with that. So to avoid the position where you're kind of on the defensive and they're beating you over the head, you actually need to get them to a place where, both of us are incandescent. What are we going to do about this problem? Let's
that strikes me as very similar to what I think of as the squash and the squeeze technique, which after I don't know if you,
I haven't heard of that. No.
Children were young enough, but so Julia Donaldson, the Gruffalo author, wrote a book called A Squash and a Squeeze. And it's basically a woman comes to, I think, the local priest and said, "Oh, my house is too small. It's a squash and a squeeze." And the priest says, "Well, bring your duck inside and keep the duck in." And she comes back a week later and says, "It's now even more problematic. So I'll bring the goat in." And anyway, it carries on with fantastic illustration from Axel Scheffler, fantastic rhyming, humorous rhymes from Julia Dodson, but it kind of ends, and apologies if anybody's reading this with their 3-year-olds and hasn't got to the end, skip forward. But at the end, she's got cows, horses, donkeys in the house with her, and she goes and says, "It's a squash and a squeeze." She says, "Well, look, take the donkey, take the cow, put them all in the yard, just and go back to the house." And she comes back to him and says, "It's fantastic. I've got all this space." And it's and the principle of kind of building up the problem and then releasing some of the tension. Actually, that wasn't that bad after all. And we can, and that's important, because you need to get perspective. So your technique is build it up so that it becomes important enough to work on. Whereas my mind is similar, but it builds it up. But then you can kind of relax back to the reality of the situation. It's not as bad as we think. So we can work the problem. It's the world's another children's story. The world's not going to fall on our head. We've got time. We can act. Because there is that kind of fatalism sometimes that can creep into projects, which will kill them within days.
No, you're right. And you need to kind of encourage everybody involved to look at it in a different way, to actually no, we're looking at it as a glass half empty. What happens if we look at it as a glass half full? I think that's absolutely right. I was intrigued by when you were talking about earlier, and you talked about the kind of language that the person you described has developed for challenging the project sponsor. And I think that's something that project managers can learn as well, is to develop forms of words. I mean, the simplest kinds of things are, along the lines that, if I, then you. So if I do this, will you do that? Or if you do this, then I'll do that. The kind of exchange. And the kind of counterpoint to that is when you, then I, which is kind of, when you shout at me, then I feel, why should I care? It's finding little forms of language that allow you to express ideas that may be emotionally or emotionally difficult and emotionally challenging.
We must acknowledge this is all quite culturally, can be quite culturally specific. The kind of form of language that might work for us in the UK, for example, may not work in another culture. And I say that because, I know that these videos are watched from both, YouTube tells me that there are people in hundreds of different countries watching these videos. And, some of the biggest countries in terms of viewership for my videos have very different business cultures, very different kind of social cultures to the ones where you and I have grown up and learned to operate. And therefore, the general advice that you've given, which is to find forms of language that work in your culture, is exactly right. But please don't assume necessarily that the examples both that Jonathan and I have given are going to work for you in your culture, because they might not work well with the people you're dealing with.
I agree with that completely, Mike. And of course, it goes beyond the sort of geography of cultures and into organizational culture. One particular way of working or one particular form won't work in a given organization, whereas it'll work in another. So when you change organizations, you have to learn a new language, just as when you move from one country to another.
That's right. When you move from a startup to a government department, you're in for a bit of a shock.
Yes, totally. So I think being empathetic, being objective, trying to step back, focusing on the project the whole time, and keeping the project sponsor focused on the project. And I think really choosing your battles, knowing when you can win this and when you can't, and kind of being careful to really focus on the ones that you can win, the ones that are important and that you can win. And you have to accept that there are times when maybe there are going to be decisions made, maybe the project sponsor is going to do things that you disagree with. You just have to let that go, really. That's the nature of business. It's not a democracy. even
right.
the most the most well-run organizations, and you just say, okay, I'll just take it on the chin. I think it's important for you or for me as somebody working with somebody else, and for my well-being and mental health, that I can let things go and that I can be objective, because otherwise it's very easy to get all sorts of stories going in your head, and you think, oh God, I'm a failure, I'm an imposter, this is going to be awful. No, you're just creating this in your own mind. It's not really not as bad as you think it was, or you think it is.
Yeah, I mean, we're tramping on the territory, and it occurs to me, you and I both share a particular fascination with and admiration of the tools of transactional analysis for use in this. So I can't let you go without inviting you to suggest one of the tools from transactional analysis that you would readily use to resolve the sorts of problems you might have with relationships with a senior person on a project.
Yeah, I would suggest a very simple tool. It sounds very simple. I don't know. It sounds simple to me, which is the idea of anchoring, which and I use it when I'm preparing for a meeting, for a presentation, for something else, and I take a moment, particularly if it's going to be a difficult presentation, a difficult meeting, and I'm maybe a little bit apprehensive. First of all, I ask myself, well, what could possibly go wrong? And maybe even imagine the worst thing that could go wrong and have a laugh about that. But I also think about the times that I've done something similar before, and how did I do that? And what did that feel like? And I actually physically get myself into that space where I can relive those emotions. I just remember, I'm remembering that amazing meeting. I'm remembering that fantastic presentation, and all the emotions that were associated with that come flooding back.
Yeah.
And the extraordinary thing, I mean, it sounds like kind of hocus pocus, but you can actually physically have a space where I'm standing now. I think this is where I recover those emotions. And you can move to that space. So you can say, I'm going to move into and the emotions will come flooding back, and I will find the meeting. I'll be in a much better place to have that meeting, or to give that presentation, or to deliver that difficult news, because I've emotionally prepared myself. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, I suppose in simple terms, it's this idea that you can stand in front of the mirror and say, every day in every way I will get better and better. And if you genuinely believe that, and if you feel good about that, it kind of works. You can talk yourself into a particular
I think
psychological
there is quite a lot
situation.
of evidence that the brain actually struggles to determine the difference between reality and fantasy. And of course, we see it in the news every day. But what that means is that even if you haven't had an experience of a similar event going well, if you can visualize it with enough clarity, with enough precision, and you can kind of play that kind of story of your visualization of that meeting going really well through in your mind a number of times, and kind of put yourself into that position and feel what it will feel like to be leaving that meeting, that can build that kind of store of memories, so that when you go into that situation, already your mind is expecting it to be successful. Now, that hopefully won't make you complacent, but what it will do is it will affect your body language so that you're just that little bit more confident. And of course, we know that the body language you put out into the world affects the response you get back from the person in front of you. And so it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that's the basis of a lot of this, is you create the reality by preparing for it. So I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Jonathan, we need to kind of wrap this up quite soon, because
it's getting late.
People are going to be thinking, oh, I've been watching a lot of this. Any last kind of tip or anything you want to emphasize before I invite you to tell us a bit more about how people can get in touch with the work that you're doing?
Trying to manage time. Now, I say that not in a project management sense of managing the schedule, but when you're talking to somebody, just relaxing and allowing the pace of the conversation to go at a speed that you're comfortable with, because you don't want to find yourself rushing and you kind of gabbling, and then you're losing control of the conversation. And there are a number of techniques that you can use beyond just kind of mindfulness. I mean, using good questions. I mean, there's a great way, if your project sponsor is coming down at you, and the great way to slow them down is to throw questions back at them. Kind of, because while they're responding, you've got time to kind of to recover and think about what next. And you're also hopefully getting some kind of sense as to why are they saying what they're saying, or why are they behaving in the way they're behaving. So I mean, it's the old politician's trick, but if you use it professionally and ethically, rather than as a reason not to answer a question, reflecting back a question at somebody is an extremely simple and useful technique, and one that you can practice. So you know, if you ask me the question, I say, Mike, that's interesting. Why? Can I ask you why you've asked me that? No.
Or even just repeating the question back.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is can be tremendously powerful is they kind of talk at you, and you pause and you actually mentally count to 5. And if they say, you've got nothing to say, if you can then say something like, well, what you just said is important, I need to reflect on it. What you're basically saying is you're clever, and I'm impressed, and I'm not, and that's very flattering to them. Nobody's going to say, oh, okay, yes, that wasn't really very important. So I think slowing the thing down is a great tip to end with. So Jonathan, I know you've got lots of different kind of components to your kind of professional history. How can people find out more about what you're doing, and perhaps benefit more from your activities in the project management world?
Thank you for asking that, Mike. Well, I think the first place I would point people at is the Major Project Association YouTube channel, where you've got a lot of the interviews that I've done with other people. That's a great source. I also manage the knowledge repository on the Major Projects Association website. So there are nearly 2,000 reports, insights, lessons learned. Great. I mean, it's fully searchable, and it's also fully open access, so people can just go in there, use whatever they need. And the other thing is the kind of activities that we organize. Now, a large chunk of those are restricted to our members, so it's worth checking whether you're a member, actually, because a lot of people.
I was going to say, perhaps you could actually tell our audience just in a couple of sentences, your elevator pitch, what the Major Projects Association is and who it might be right for. If people are thinking, oh, I do big projects, maybe that's something for me. What is the Major Projects Association?
Yes, so the association is effectively a community of practice. I think when it was started 40 years ago, nobody would know what that meant, but it's a community of practice for individuals and organizations who are working in major projects. And a major project is a complex project, so it doesn't have to be 400 billion. It could be I don't know, £1 million, but it's very complex. It is by, we only have organizations as members, so you can't become an individual member. But if your organization kind of lives and breathes major projects, it doesn't really work if occasionally you're kind of on the periphery and you do lots of projects and one or two of them are major. No, this needs to be you're working with complex projects 5 days a week, if not 7 days a week. Then this could be a great community of practice for you. And basically the association, we're funded by our subscriptions from our member organizations, and we exist to enable knowledge sharing across the network of our members so that people can get better at initiating and delivering and innovating on major projects. So it's as simple as that. I really love it because the great thing about major projects is you get to talk about all the things that we've been talking about, Mike.
Yeah.
I find I don't have to talk to people about Gantt charts or earned value or cost control or any of the kind of fundamentals of project management, because actually, if you haven't got those, you might as well give up in the first instance. But if you have got those, the kinds of things that we do in the Major Projects Association are the things that will determine whether what you deliver is going to be successful and is going to deliver value or not.
Yeah, but I think it is worth reiterating that if you're interested in major projects, but it's not the right place for your organization to join, there is a huge wealth of knowledge that you can learn from, all of which, subject to the rules and regulations of whatever professional association you're a member of, could well earn you continuing professional development credits, PDUs, if you're PMI. And it's all of that. There's a huge amount available both on the YouTube channel, which I think is criminally underused. And I hope, if nothing else, this spurs more people to watch some of the videos that you've put up there and the knowledge repository. And I'll put links both on screen and down in the description. And if you really want to get a first introduction to what major projects are and what they're about and how you can engage with them as a career move, I can't recommend any better article than the one that you've written, Jonathan, for the Online PM Courses website. Link on the screen and below as well. So are there any other ways that people can engage with you, or is that the main? Have you covered the main ones?
Well,
there?
personally, I'd love people to connect with me on LinkedIn. We have a Facebook community, we have a LinkedIn community, and obviously on Twitter. Twitter is not necessarily a place for engagement, but certainly LinkedIn and Facebook, and those are very important both to me and to the association, because it's important that although we're a members only association, we have a kind of semi-permeable barrier so that we can engage with people who are not members of the association. We can share knowledge across that barrier, and Facebook and LinkedIn are just really great tools for doing that. Brilliant.
Jonathan, as always, it has been a great pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Mike. It was a real pleasure.
Please do give us a thumbs up if you like this video. I'll be creating loads more great project management content, so please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of it. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.